By mid-1942, Japan stood at the height of its wartime power. In just 6 months, its forces had swept across the Pacific and Southeast Asia, in one of the fastest military expansions in modern history. From the Philippines to Malaya, from Hong Kong to the Dutch East Indies, the rising sun flew over territories that together formed an empire larger than any Japan had ever dreamed possible. The victory at Pearl Harbor had shattered the American Pacific Fleet and stunned the world. The audacious air raid on December 7, 1941, sank or crippled 8 battleships and killed more than 2,400 Americans. Japan's gamble had paid off, or so it seemed. Its naval strategists, led by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, believed the United States would sue for peace, or at least be forced into a defensive posture for years. The psychological blow was expected to buy Japan time to fortify its new empire behind a defensive wall stretching from the Aleutians to the Solomon Islands. But by early 1942, cracks began to show. Japan had gained territory but not control. The resource lines were stretched across thousands of miles of ocean. The vastness of the Pacific that had once been Japan's shield now became its weakness. Every new conquest demanded ships, fuel, and men, all of which Japan could barely sustain. Meanwhile, the United States was not broken. The industrial machine that Yamamoto himself had warned his superiors about, "I fear we have awakened a sleeping giant," was stirring to life. Shipyards in California, factories in Detroit, and assembly lines across the country were already replacing the losses from Pearl Harbor. New aircraft carriers were being laid down. Pilots were training in waves. To Yamamoto, the answer was clear. Japan had to destroy the remaining American carriers before they multiplied. A decisive naval battle, one that would permanently cripple American offensive capacity, was the only way to secure Japan's perimeter. The plan was codenamed Operation MI, the assault on Midway Atoll, a small but strategically vital outpost roughly halfway between Asia and North America. Midway's airfields allowed the U.S. to project reconnaissance and aircraft deep into the Pacific. Its loss would expose Hawaii, and perhaps the U.S. West Coast, into further attack. The Imperial Japanese Navy's plan was bold, complex, and dangerously overconfident. Yamamoto would send 4 carriers and a vast support fleet to strike Midway. A separate force would feint north toward the Aleutian Islands, hoping to lure American forces away from the true target. Once Midway was seized, the Japanese carriers would destroy any U.S. reinforcements that appeared, the kind of decisive battle Japan's naval doctrine had always envisioned. But this time, the Americans were not blind. Months before the fleets ever sighted each other, another war had been raging, one fought in radio signals, ciphers, and fragments of intercepted code. In a small, cramped room at Pearl Harbor, Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team at Station Hypo had been tirelessly working to break the Japanese naval code known as JN-25. By May 1942, they had decrypted enough to know that the Japanese were planning an operation designated AF. But what was AF? Tokyo believed the Americans had no clue. To confirm their suspicion, Rochefort devised a trap. Midway's base was ordered to send an unencrypted message reporting that its freshwater plant had broken down. Hours later, Japanese intelligence intercepted a radio transmission reporting that AF is short of water. That was the confirmation Nimitz needed. F was Midway. Armed with that knowledge, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, made one of the boldest decisions of the war. Instead of falling for Yamamoto's trap, he decided to set one of his own. The U.S. would ambush the Japanese fleet at Midway, with 3 available carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the damaged but hastily repaired Yorktown. The Yorktown had been heavily damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea just weeks earlier. Estimates said it would take months to repair. But in one of the most remarkable engineering efforts of the war, the shipyard crews at Pearl Harbor worked around the clock. Within 72 hours, Yorktown was declared battle-ready, patched armed, and sent back to sea. As the American carriers steamed toward a position northeast of Midway, they held the advantage of surprise, a reversal of the situation at Pearl Harbor. But the odds were still daunting. The Japanese fleet was larger, its pilots among the best in the world, and its operational doctrine battle-tested from years of war in China and the Pacific. Both sides believed they knew what awaited them. Both were wrong. For Yamamoto, the Midway operation would be the masterstroke of his career, the blow that would end American resistance. For Nimitz, it would be a desperate gamble, an all-or-nothing defense fought by 3 carriers and a handful of land-based aircraft. The stage was set. 2 armadas, separated by hundreds of miles of open sea, were moving toward a collision that neither side fully understood. And in that vast ocean, beneath the deceptive calm of June skies, destiny was aligning itself minute by minute. By late May 1942, the Pacific was alive with motion. Across thousands of nautical miles, fleets moved in silence, steel giants navigating an ocean that seemed endless, each one chasing a plan that could reshape the Imperial Japanese Navy departed from Hashirajima anchorage on Aikau, May 26, 1942. At its heart sailed Vice Admiral Chuichi, Nagumo's carrier strike force, the same commander, who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. His 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, carried a combined air wing of more than 250 aircraft. Supporting them were battleships, cruisers, destroyers, oilers, and troop transports bound for Midway itself. To observers aboard the Japanese ships, the operation felt inevitable. The mood was confident, even celebratory. The Pearl Harbor raid had been flawless, the conquest of the Dutch East Indies unstoppable. Now they believed they were marching toward the final annihilation of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. But while Japanese sailors toasted their impending victory, in Pearl Harbor's command center, Admiral Nimitz was reading every intercepted transmission the Japanese unknowingly sent. Through late May and early June, American intelligence tracked the enemy's progress with remarkable precision. U.S. submarines shadowed Japanese movements near the Marshall Islands. Long-range reconnaissance planes flew from Midway, searching the horizon for any sign of the approaching fleet. Nimitz knew the timing. He knew the target, but he did not know where the Japanese carriers themselves were positioned or when they would strike. His plan depended on a critical assumption, that the Japanese, expecting to catch the Americans by surprise, would approach Midway from the northwest. So he positioned his carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, roughly 350 miles northeast of the atoll, beyond the enemy's anticipated search arcs. If the Japanese came as expected, the Americans would have the advantage of surprise. If Nimitz guessed wrong, the battle and the Pacific would be lost. Far to the rear, aboard the battleship Yamato, the mastermind of the operation, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commanded the entire combined fleet. A veteran strategist and student of American industrial power, Yamamoto understood the stakes better than anyone. He had warned Tokyo before Pearl Harbor that Japan's initial victories would be short-lived if the war dragged on. But now, driven by national momentum and the illusion of invincibility, even Yamamoto was caught in the logic of escalation. He would strike at Midway and crush the enemy before American shipyards could flood the Pacific with new carriers. To ensure success, he ordered a series of simultaneous diversions, one fleet attacking the Aleutian Islands to the north, another scouting group sweeping the Pacific for stragglers. The plan on paper was precise, almost mathematical, but that precision was also its weakness. The Japanese command structure relied on rigid timing and perfect coordination. Any delay, any breakdown in communication would cascade across the operation. And in war, especially at sea, perfection never lasts. For the Americans, intelligence was now the decisive weapon. Station Hypo continued to intercept Japanese messages through early June, confirming their timetable. Analysts tracked call signs, decoded partial coordinates, and pinpointed the approaching fleet's expected arrival. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding Task Force 16 aboard Enterprise, and Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher aboard Yorktown, coordinated under Nimitz's overarching orders, ambush and destroy the enemy carriers. The Americans had fewer ships, fewer aircraft, and less experience, but they had something the Japanese lacked: foresight. Still, the margin of error was razor thin. Even a few hours of misjudgment could swing the balance entirely. The vastness of the Pacific meant that 2 opposing fleets could sail within 200 miles of each other and remain unseen. Radar technology, still primitive, offered limited advantage. Detection depended on the skill, or luck, of reconnaissance pilots scanning empty horizons. Meanwhile, on the tiny coral outpost of Midway, U.S. Marines and Navy personnel prepared for the assault. Sandbagged bunkers lined the beaches. Anti-aircraft batteries were dug into the sand. Aircraft from Marine Fighter Squadron 2I-21 and Army Air Force's B-17 bombers crowded the short runway. Everyone knew what was coming, and few expected to survive it. In the pre-dawn hours of June 3rd, American patrol aircraft sighted the first elements of the Japanese invasion force, nearly 700 miles west of Midway. The message went out: enemy sighted. At Pearl Harbor, Nimitz received the signal and smiled quietly. His gamble was working. The enemy was coming exactly as predicted. Now everything depended on timing and luck. For Admiral Nagumo, the morning of June 4th began like countless others. He had complete faith in his pilots and in the doctrine that had carried Japan to victory after victory. His air groups were the best in the world, veterans of the South Pacific campaigns, masters of carrier warfare. At dawn, he launched his first wave against Midway, 108 aircraft led by Lieutenant Commander Tomonaga Joichi. They bombed and strafed the island with brutal efficiency, but the American defenses held firm. Reports from returning planes were mixed. Midway was damaged but not destroyed. Nagumo now faced a dilemma, one that would define the next few hours of his life. Should he rearm his reserve planes for a second strike on Midway, or hold them for the American carriers which might appear at any moment? He hesitated, and in that hesitation, history began to shift. By mid-morning, around 7:15 a.m., the sea between Midway and the Japanese fleet remained deceptively tranquil. Above it, in the blinding sunlight, reconnaissance planes from both sides searched frantically. American scout planes finally spotted the enemy and transmitted a crucial contact report. Many enemy ships, including carriers. That message raced through the airwaves to Admiral Spruance aboard Enterprise. The order went out: launch all available aircraft. Engines roared to life. Bombers were rolled forward. Pilots took their last checks. Somewhere in that hurried preparation, a chain of coincidences, weather, luck, human error, aligned into the moment that would soon decide the fate of the Pacific. At 10:20 a.m., the Japanese fleet stood undefeated, its carriers glistening under the tropical sun. At 10:25, 3 of them would be burning, victims of 5 minutes that shattered Japan's illusion of destiny. War at sea in 1942 was fought through machines, engines, steel, aircraft, but its outcome still depended on human nerves. On both sides of the Pacific, the men who flew, fought, and died at Midway were not nameless soldiers. They were trained professionals living inside the narrow margin between duty and death. For the Japanese aviators aboard the 4 carriers, discipline was absolute. Most had spent years perfecting their craft, drilled into the precision of carrier takeoffs and formation attacks. Pilots bowed before their commanders, some writing final letters home before dawn. In the Imperial Navy, loss was not failure. It was honor fulfilled in service to the Emperor. On the American side, the tone was different but no less determined. Many U.S. Navy pilots had barely 6 months of carrier experience. Some had never seen combat. They were citizen aviators, thrown into a struggle against the most seasoned naval airmen on Earth. On the morning of June 4th, as they strapped into SBD Dauntless dive bombers and TBD Devastator torpedo planes, they knew the odds were brutal. Yet courage at Midway did not come from confidence, and it came from duty. Pilots like Lieutenant Commander John C. Waldron of Torpedo Squadron 8 led their crews into near-certain death. Waldron's squadron from Hornet launched without proper fighter escort, flying low and slow toward the Japanese fleet. Every man who followed him knew what it meant. All 15 aircraft were shot down. Only one pilot, Ensign George Gay, survived, floating for hours in the wreckage as he watched the battle unfold above him. The same human resolve existed on the Japanese side. Deck crews worked under suffocating heat, dragging bombs across steel floors slick with oil. Commanders like Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the Pearl Harbor strike, stood on carrier bridges watching the sky for returning formations, confident that their system, their training, and their gods of fortune would prevail. But war does not reward confidence. It rewards adaptation. And by June 4, 1942, one side would adapt just fast enough to survive. Before Midway, Japan's naval doctrine had been built on the concept of the decisive battle, a single clash of fleets that would decide the outcome of war. It came from decades of strategy dating back to Tsushima in 1905, where the Japanese Navy had annihilated the Russian fleet with perfect coordination and superior gunnery. The same mindset guided Yamamoto's planners in 1942. Their plan assumed that the enemy would react predictably, that once Midway was attacked, the U.S. carriers would rush in blindly to defend it. The Japanese carriers would then catch them in open sea and finish what they had begun at Pearl Harbor. Every element of Operation MI, from the Aleutian diversion to the carrier formations, was designed around that assumption. But carrier warfare was evolving faster than anyone realized. The old idea of fleet gunnery duels was gone. Now battles were fought over the horizon, decided by aircraft that could strike from hundreds of miles away. That meant whoever located the enemy first held the advantage, not the side with the most ships. Nagumo's first strike against Midway went as planned. His air crews bombed the island's runways and fuel depots. But when reports came in that another strike was needed, he ordered his reserve aircraft, armed with torpedoes for ship attacks, to be rearmed with land bombs instead. Below deck, mechanics began the slow, dangerous process of swapping ordnance. Then, at 7:40 a.m., a scout plane radioed that enemy ships, possibly carriers, had been sighted. Nagumo hesitated. Should he strike again at Midway or prepare for the approaching U.S. fleet? His hesitation was fatal. The decks of Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu became chaos. Bombs and fuel hoses scattered, planes half-armed, crews rushing to complete conflicting orders. By the time the American dive bombers appeared at 10:20 a.m., the Japanese carriers were in their most vulnerable state. Decks loaded with volatile ordnance fueled planes, and no air patrols in position. Tactical doctrine, once Japan's greatest weapon, had become its trap. The Battle of Midway was won not by firepower alone, but by information. Technology and code-breaking shaped the engagement long before the first bomb fell. American cryptanalysts at Station Hypo had turned the tide of intelligence warfare. Their partial decryption of JN-25 gave the U.S. Navy the one thing the Japanese had always relied upon themselves: surprise. That single advantage neutralized Japan's superior training and numbers. On the technical side, the difference in aircraft performance was striking. The Japanese A6M0 was still the most maneuverable fighter in the Pacific, with unmatched range and agility. But the Americans had learned its weaknesses, especially its lack of armor and self-sealing fuel tanks. The U.S. Navy's SBD Dauntless dive bomber, though slower, was rugged and deadly accurate when flown correctly. It could dive almost vertically without disintegrating, release a bomb from 2,000 feet, and pull up just in time to escape the explosion. The U.S. TBD Devastator torpedo bomber, on the other hand, was outdated and slow. Many of them never made it to their targets, but the sacrifice of those pilots, flying low at 100 knots under relentless zero attacks, drew the Japanese combat air patrols down to sea level. That left the sky above clear for the dauntless squadrons arriving moments later. In those few minutes, technology, timing, and intelligence converged. American radar aboard Midway detected incoming raids early enough for the island to scramble defenses. Meanwhile, the U.S. carriers, guided by rough bearings from reconnaissance planes, launched their strikes knowing exactly where the enemy would be. The Japanese, by contrast, had no radar and limited reconnaissance coverage. Their spotter planes failed to find the U.S. carriers in time, a delay compounded by rigid communication protocols that slowed every response. For all its sophistication, Japan's fleet fought blind. For all its inexperience, America's fleet fought informed. When Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto planned Operation MI, he wasn't simply targeting an island. He was betting the fate of the Pacific War on one battle. Japan's expansion after Pearl Harbor had been swift and devastating. From Singapore to the Philippines, every strike had succeeded. But by mid-1942, the empire was stretched thin. Thousands of miles of ocean separated its garrisons, supply lines, and oil reserves. Yamamoto knew the U.S. would rebuild, His only hope was to cripple the American carrier force before it grew too powerful. That's what Midway was meant to achieve. Not conquest, but annihilation. Destroy the remaining U.S. carriers and America would lose its ability to strike back. Japan could then fortify its defensive perimeter, forcing Washington into a negotiated peace. It was, on paper, a brilliant move, but strategy depends on accurate assumptions, and Yamamoto's were wrong. He assumed the U.S. carriers were still reacting, still guessing. He believed surprise was his weapon, not realizing that the Americans already knew his plan. Worse, his own fleet organization was dangerously overcomplicated. The carriers and battleships were separated by hundreds of miles. Communications were rigid, and air cover coordination was fragmented. The Japanese armada was a masterpiece of precision, but also of inflexibility. When reality deviated from plan, the structure collapsed under its own complexity. The American plan, by contrast, was brutally simple. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz placed his 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, northeast of Midway, lying in wait. He didn't need to outguess Yamamoto. He only needed to ambush him. In the end, Midway became the ultimate paradox of strategy. The side that planned too perfectly lost to the side that adapted. The battle's outcome reflected not just strategies, but personalities. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commander of the Japanese carrier striking force, was a veteran of surface warfare, a product of an older navy that valued battleships and decisive gunnery duels. He was brave, disciplined, and loyal, but he was also cautious, uncomfortable with the fast-changing realities of carrier combat. At Midway, that caution became paralysis. When conflicting reports reached him, the need for a second strike on Midway, the appearance of enemy carriers, Nagumo hesitated, trying to balance both options instead of committing to one. His fleet's power lay in rapid, coordinated airstrikes, yet for nearly an hour his decks remained in limbo. Planes were refueled, disarmed, rearmed, then held again. When the first American bombs fell, Nagumo's carriers were caught mid-reload. He had followed procedure, but in a war where minutes decided victory, procedure was death. On the other side stood Admiral Raymond Spruance, a calm, analytical thinker with no background in aviation. His advantage was not mastery of air tactics. It was his ability to delegate and decide quickly. He trusted his aviators to do their jobs, relied on intelligence, and refused to micromanage. When the time came to launch the strike on the Japanese carriers, Spruance didn't wait for perfect coordination. He ordered his groups to launch immediately, even though some were short on fuel and others still forming. It was a gamble, but in war, acting fast with 80% certainty is better than acting late with 100%. Spruance's decisiveness mirrored a new kind of warfare, flexible, adaptive, decentralized. Nagumo's adherence to hierarchy represented the old leadership at Midway wasn't about brilliance. It was about tempo. The commander who moved first dictated the rhythm. The one who waited was left to burn. Every great military disaster begins with disbelief, the moment when confidence blinds judgment. For months, Japan's navy had sailed from victory to victory. The pilots aboard Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu had destroyed fleets, airfields, and cities without losing a single carrier. To them, the idea that an inferior enemy could locate and destroy them in open ocean was unthinkable. That psychological armor, the myth of invincibility, was both their strength and their weakness. When the first American dive bombers appeared high above the fleet at 10:20 a.m., most Japanese lookouts never saw them until it was too late. The Zeros were all down low, chasing torpedo planes. The carriers' decks were filled with fueled aircraft and exposed ordnance. In 5 minutes, everything changed. 3 bombs hit Kaga, 4 struck Soryu, and 1, guided almost by fate, plunged through Akagi's flight deck and detonated among armed aircraft below. Each explosion ripped through fuel lines, sending flames racing through hangars. The once unshakable Japanese air crews, the best in the world, now faced chaos. Fires raged out of control. Ammunition cooked off like thunder. Men jumped overboard into burning seas. Admiral Nagumo stood frozen, watching from the bridge of Akagi as the ship that had led the Pearl Harbor attack was engulfed in flames. In minutes, 3 of his 4 carriers were crippled beyond recovery. The psychological shock was total, the first real defeat Japan's Navy had suffered in centuries. On the American side, disbelief took a different form, a stunned silence. The pilots of the dauntless squadrons, many of them young and exhausted, could hardly comprehend what they had done. Some thought they were hallucinating. Others shouted prayers or curses into their radios. They had turned the Pacific's tide in less than 5 minutes. For Japan, that moment wasn't just a tactical loss. It was an identity collapse. The aura of perfection that had defined its naval spirit was shattered, replaced by confusion and denial. In the months that followed, Japan would hide the extent of the loss from its own people, while its admirals quietly understood the truth. The empire's naval supremacy had died at Midway. When the fires were finally out, 3 carriers lay destroyed. The 4th Hiryu launched a desperate counterattack, scoring hits on Yorktown, but by evening she too was burning. By dawn on June 5th, the once invincible Kido Butai, the strike force of Pearl Harbor, no longer existed. Japan lost 4 frontline carriers, 248 aircraft, and over 3,000 sailors and pilots, many of them irreplaceable veterans from the early war years. The United States lost 1 carrier and 307 men, but the true loss was unseen. The core of Japan's naval air power, the skilled aviators and deck crews who could not be replaced. The empire would continue to fight for 3 more years, but from that day forward it would always be on the defensive. The Battle of Midway did not just alter the course of war, it altered the psychology of it. The hunter had become the hunted. The war in the Pacific would rage for 3 more years, but the outcome was already decided in those 5 minutes of fire and fate. The smoke over Midway drifted for hours, a gray shroud over the Pacific, carried by wind and silence. Below it, twisted wrecks sank one by one, swallowed by the sea that had once carried Japan's dreams of empire. The men who survived those 5 minutes would never forget the sound. The roar of exploding fuel tanks, the screams of trapped deck crews, the deep, cracking groan of carriers breaking apart, the same ships that had unleashed Pearl Harbor now burning under the same sun. Midway was not just a battle. It was a reckoning. For the first time since the war began, Japan's naval supremacy, built through decades of discipline, ambition and pride, had met an enemy it could not outthink, outfly or outfight. It wasn't about numbers. It wasn't even about luck, though timing played its part. It was about adaptation. The Americans had learned from every defeat, Pearl Harbor, Coral Sea, the Philippines, and turned that knowledge into victory. Japan, bound by doctrine and tradition, had learned too little too late. The Battle of Midway marked the exact midpoint of the Pacific War. Before it, Japan expanded. After it, Japan retreated. Every island captured before June 1942 would in time be retaken. Every carrier lost that day would remain irreplaceable, and every officer who witnessed that sudden reversal understood what it meant. The empire's horizon had begun to fade. When historians look back at the Second World War, Midway stands as more than a military turning point. It's a study in the fragility of power, how empires rise through precision but fall through overconfidence, how information, invisible, silent, unseen, can defeat steel and fire, and how in war the smallest window of time can reshape the destiny of nations. 5 minutes. That's all it took for the ocean's balance to change. From the moment the first American bomb fell on Kaga, Japan's future was sealed not by defeat alone, but by the loss of its finest, its most experienced airmen, its most seasoned deck officers, its most confident leaders. Without them, every future battle, Guadalcanal, the Philippine Sea, Leyte Gulf, would be fought by a navy that no longer remembered victory, only survival. And yet, within that destruction lay the seed of something larger, the moment when the tide of history itself turned. For the United States, Midway became a symbol of resolve, a sign that courage, intelligence, and sacrifice could overcome even the most powerful enemy. For Japan, it became a quiet wound, an unspoken lesson in humility and the dangers of perfection. The Pacific War would still demand countless lives. Islands like Tarawa, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa would be fought over with terrible cost. Hiroshima and Nagasaki would burn before the war finally ended. But the path to all of it, the slow unraveling of Japan's empire, began here, on a calm morning in June 1942, in those 5 fleeting minutes when everything changed. The sea remembers it all. The fire, the silence, the ships that never came home, and if you stand today on the edge of Midway Atoll, where the wind still whispers across the reefs and the waves break against the coral, you can almost hear it. The echo of engines, the distant thunder of dive bombers, and the final cries of an empire collapsing beneath the weight of its own ambition. 5 minutes of chaos, 5 minutes of courage, 5 minutes that decided the Pacific, the moment when the tide turned, and Japan's dreams of victory sank forever beneath the blue.